Well, I'd like to call the hearing to order. This is a hearing of the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Western Hemisphere, transnational crime, civilian security, democracy, human rights, and global women's issues. Senator Rubio, I think we have the honor of the subcommittee with the longest name of any in the Senate. Hearing will come to order, and it is a pleasure to welcome two distinguished panels of witnesses for this hearing on vaccine diplomacy in Latin America and the Caribbean and the importance of U.S. engagement in the region. I want to thank Ranking Member Senator Rubio and his team for helping develop this hearing and for always advancing the important work of this subcommittee and always having a passion for the region. Americans have learned a lot of hard lessons since the COVID-19 pandemic first reached our shores in early 2020, the importance of a strong public health system, the vulnerability of and the valuable work performed by our essential health workers, disparities in our economic system that can be exacerbated by unforeseen crises, the effectiveness of vaccines, and the difficulties of achieving political consensus even when faced with a common threat. Another lesson the pandemic has taught us is that we are inextricably linked to other nations, particularly our neighbors in the Americas. Disease doesn't stop at borders. Our health, to a degree, depends on the health of our brothers and sisters in Latin America and the Caribbean. Latin America and the Caribbean has suffered greatly during the pandemic, more than 1.5 million dead, tens of millions of cases. 30% of the deaths in the world attributed to pandemic are in the Caribbean and the Americas, with only 8% of the population. And so this has been a region that's been hit particularly hard. I saw some of the effects of the pandemic firsthand in the region this summer when I joined Senator Portman and 4 other Senate colleagues in a bipartisan CODEL to visit Mexico, Ecuador, Colombia, and Guatemala. We talked in those nations about the effect of the pandemic, but we also heard the gratitude of these nations for U.S. vaccine diplomacy in the region, a common story. And we were arriving in capitals and talking to presidents at about the same time as significant American vaccines were arriving to be distributed in these countries. A common story that we heard was that when it comes to vaccines, we think the American vaccines are the best, and you're giving them to us. We are getting vaccines from China, Russia that we are purchasing, and sometimes the shipment gets delayed. And in the instance of China, if we happen to say something about Taiwan, the contract will mysteriously disappear and we'll never get vaccines. And so there was a real window that was opening, we viewed, in the Americas because there was gratitude for the U.S. role in delivering now, I believe, nearly 50 million vaccines into the Americas and the Caribbean. But there's much more to do. We have stepped up to provide support to our southern neighbors. It was a little belated because we wanted to take care, obviously, of our own needs first, but distribution of vaccines and other humanitarian aid, most notably through sharp increase in funding through the American Rescue Plan, has started to flow. More needs to be done. While the U.S. initially focused on overcoming the public health crisis at home, outside actors like China and Russia have taken this opportunity to exert their influence, really continue their influence in Latin America and the Caribbean, and that has potentially deleterious long-term effects on U.S. interests and values in the region. So after almost 2 years now of living with COVID, this hearing is an opportunity to consider our successes and failures in responding to the pandemic in the Americas and what we can do to continue to improve our efforts in the region. I'm hopeful that testimony from our panels of witnesses, both from the State Department and outside experts, can help us better understand these vital issues and chart a path forward. And I now want to turn it over to my ranking member, Senator Rubio, for his remarks before I introduce our first panel.
Well, thank you for holding this hearing. And as the former chairman of this committee who had to read that long title, we could never come up with an acronym. So if you can, that'd be great. But I appreciate you both being here today. You know, we're coming up on the 2-year anniversary of that day that patients in Wuhan, China, first publicly reported symptoms of a disease that we now know has swept and changed the world. And no region's been hit harder, as the chairman said, than Latin America, and the Caribbean in particular. Not just in terms of the numbers of those that have been afflicted by the disease and ultimately killed by this virus, but also the effects that it's had on unemployment, on rising poverty, on political instability. It's been pretty dramatic. And that what it's done is it's made the region ripe and vulnerable to malign actors to come in and try to leverage them. We've seen that, of course, from the Chinese Communist Party. We've seen it from Putin's Russia, and now even Cuba appears to be threatening to get into that game, basically exploiting access to a vaccine in the absence of a better alternative to extract concessions from different countries in the region. And they frankly made no effort to hide the fact that these vaccines come with strings attached. One example is Paraguay. In April of this year, Paraguay had its largest outbreak wave of COVID cases, and the Chinese Communist Party's diplomats made it very clear that they would only deliver vaccines to Paraguay if they severed ties with Taiwan. And in Brazil, there seems to have been some success in convincing Brazilian officials to allow Huawei to compete to develop the 5G network. And strong evidence of that is the fact that 2 weeks after Brazil's communication minister went to Beijing to ask for vaccines, it reversed his decision to ban Huawei from competing. And then, of course, Putin's Russia has gotten into this as well, providing really millions of dubious Sputnik vaccines to countries around the region. And I say dubious because there's been cases now where what's in that little vial is actually not any vaccine, much less an effective one. After delivering vaccines to Bolivia, the president of Bolivia agreed to reactivate a Russian nuclear power plant project and to allow Russia access to Bolivia's lithium reserves and their natural gas. And now, on top of all this, we face the Cuban regime with its fake Abdala vaccine, which we know nothing about in terms of its effectiveness or what long-term consequences it might have. And they're now talking about potentially exporting it to other countries, I imagine, in return for their silence and our support in the face of really brutal tactics to repress protest. Bottom line is that the lives of people across this region have become bargaining chips exchanged in return for higher profits for Chinese tech companies and lucrative business deals for Russian oligarchs. So what I hope to learn from our witnesses today is why the U.S. is allowed for this to go on for so long in Latin America. Russia delivered its first vaccines in February of 2021. China made its first delivery in March of 21. And President Biden's administration didn't deliver vaccines until June, and a full month after Senator Kaine and Menendez, who chairs the full committee, and myself sent a letter highlighting the urgent need for vaccines in Latin America. And even now, more than 109 million Chinese vaccines have been delivered, far more than the 89 million American vaccines that so far have been delivered to the region. So I was glad to see the U.S. announce the donation of approximately 500 million vaccines to 92 countries, but only 10 of those countries were in Latin America and the Caribbean. So I'm very interested in how we came up with a list of who gets these vaccines. I imagine some of it has to do with the capacity to store and deliver, and some of it, I'm curious to see how we picked who got it and how much and so forth. So I appreciate you being here today because I think it'll be insightful as we look forward to how we move forward on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rubio. I'm going to introduce our witnesses now. Kevin O'Reilly is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for State for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the Department of State. He became the Deputy Assistant Secretary after having served as the Director of the Office of Brazil and Southern Cone Affairs, previously served as DCM at the U.S. Embassy in Panama City, Panama. He's a career member of the U.S. Foreign Service. He's held many other senior level positions, including the Director of the Office of Mexican Affairs. He served as the White House National Security Council Director for North American Affairs from 2009-2011, served as a Foreign Policy Fellow in Senator Durbin's office, and he is a native of Illinois with a master's degree from the U.S. Naval War College and Johns Hopkins SAIS, received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Loyola University. Peter Natiello serves as the Acting Assistant Administrator in the U.S. Agency for International Development's Latin American and Caribbean Bureau. Before that, he served as USAID's Mission Director in Kabul, Afghanistan. He has extensive experience in Latin America with USAID, serving as Missions Director in El Salvador and Colombia. And from 2003 to 2009, he was in Bolivia, where he was Mission Director, Deputy Mission Director, and Director of the Alternative Development Program at USAID. He's also managed USAID's Democracy and Conflict Mitigation portfolio in Ecuador, where he served as a Peace Corps volunteer and subsequently as a research analyst with the Inter-American Development Bank. Fluent in Spanish and proficient in Portuguese, he has a Bachelor of Arts degree from Colorado College and a Master's of International Affairs from Columbia University. It's great to have both of you before us to discuss this important issue. And I would like to have first Mr. O'Reilly and then Mr. Natiello do opening statements, try to confine them to 5 minutes. Your full statements will be included in the record, and then we will proceed to questions. I'll just let you know, we're a little bit uncertain about voting schedule today. I think you may see members coming and going based on votes, but I think we should have good attendance over the course of the hearing. This is an important topic. We're glad to have you with us, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thank you, Chairman.
I'm not sure that mic is on. And if it is, you might want to pull it closer to you just so we can hear you clearly. We've not been using this hearing room very much. I will say that the mics could be rusty. There you go. I hear one now.
Sorry about that. Chairman Kane, Ranking Member Rubio, thank you for this opportunity to discuss the Biden-Harris administration's efforts to support Latin America and the Caribbean as they respond to and recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. They make up an important part of our efforts across the globe to save lives, end this pandemic in 2022, and prepare for the next pandemic. COVID-19 has hit the hemisphere hard, and it has worsened long-standing problems, challenges to public security, confidence in democratic institutions, corruption and inequality. Just 8.4% of humanity lives in Latin America and the Caribbean, yet as of the 1st of November, this region has had more than 46 million reported infections, 20% of cases worldwide, 31% of reported deaths, approximately 1.5 million souls lost. The pandemic hit a continent weakened by anemic growth. The IMF estimated in October that the global economy contracted by 3.1% in 2020, but the economies of Latin America and the Caribbean contracted by 7. Caribbean nations suffered declines of more than 15%. The IMF projects a return to growth of 5.8% this year, but the shock of the downturn remains. We've donated more vaccines globally than all other countries combined. That includes more than 49 million doses donated in partnership with COVAX or bilaterally to 29 countries in our hemisphere. In September, President Biden announced that the United States would donate an additional 500 million Pfizer-BioNTech doses through the COVAX facility to low- and middle-income countries, bringing the total commitment to those countries to 1.2 billion. Beneficiaries include countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. We share these doses without political conditions or expectations, with the purpose of saving lives. Beating back this pandemic requires full vaccination of 60 to 70% of each country's population. Now, the Pan American Health Organization estimates that Latin America and the Caribbean need about 720 million additional doses administered to reach that goal. 13 countries in the region now report over 60% partial vaccination, with several others close behind, but 12 have yet to reach 40% partial vaccination, with about half of those below the 20% full vaccination rate. And we have to help close that gap and do more to ensure equitable vaccine distribution across the hemisphere. We support the rapid rollout of vaccines that meet internationally accepted standards of efficacy and safety, because protecting the vulnerable demands a rigor and high standards. Vaccines without sufficient clinical data to demonstrate safety and compelling evidence of efficacy put people at risk and undermine trust. At a time of global vaccine scarcity, some governments turned to suppliers from the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation. We've seen PRC coercion, ramping up or tapering off supplies based on a willingness to adopt policies favorable to Beijing, a less than admirable wolf at the door form of diplomacy. The PRC has even offered to trade vaccines for changes in political recognition from Taipei to Beijing, a particularly cruel tactic. Russia has struggled to provide contracted amounts of Sputnik V in a timely fashion to countries from Argentina to even Mr. Maduro's regime in Venezuela. And the Russians have yet to provide adequate documentation to secure an emergency use listing from the World Health Organization. Now, next year, when the United States hosts the 9th Summit of the Americas, the President intends to place health and the state of our health systems high on the agenda. We need to work together to do better on health security with transparency and accountability. As COVID has reminded us, people's lives depend on it. Congressional support for these donations has saved lives, prevented and reduced the severity of human suffering, and helped our hemisphere begin the long and arduous process of recovering from the worst of this pandemic, building back better than before. We look forward to working with you to promote health resilience, security, and equity in our hemisphere. I thank you for your time, and I welcome your questions and comments.
Thank you, Mr. Natiello.
Chairman Kane, Ranking Member Rubio, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to testify today. I'm grateful for the committee's support for USAID's work, particularly as we respond to COVID-19 in Latin America and the Caribbean. Countries of Latin America and the Caribbean have been hit hard by the pandemic, as we've heard this morning. Although it's home only to 8% of the world's population, the region has seen 20% of all cases and just over 30% of all global deaths. The American people have demonstrated incredible generosity and solidarity with our neighbors, providing more than $500 million for USAID's COVID-19 response in Latin America and the Caribbean since March 2020. Since the beginning of the pandemic, USAID has moved quickly to mobilize new health assistance, respond to emerging food and protection needs, adapt current programming, and plan for the long-term impacts that we know will plague the region for years to come. I commend our staff and our partners and all those on the front lines who are working relentlessly to help those most in need. On the health front, our efforts include working with health ministries to minimize the risk of transmission and prevent and control infections in healthcare facilities, training and equipping rapid response teams to better track and record cases, helping countries to provide the public with reliable, verifiable information that keeps citizens informed about how best to protect themselves and each other, and providing oxygen to treat patients in the most dire need. Of course, the availability and wider distribution of vaccines has been key to the region's significant strides this year. In the last 5 months, the United States has provided more than 50 million vaccines throughout the region. These vaccines are being provided safely, equitably, and with no political strings attached. USAID is providing crucial assistance that has enabled countries to receive and distribute these life-saving vaccines. Our efforts to get shots in arms include support for cold chain management, training of vaccinators and establishment of vaccination sites, support for communications campaigns to help overcome vaccine hesitancy, and work with ministries of health to better track vaccination rates. Just last month, I saw progress on the health front firsthand when I visited Medellin, Colombia. The Department of Antioquia, of which Medellin is the capital, was severely impacted by COVID-19, seeing daily cases in excess of 4,000 and a 98% ICU occupancy rate in June 2021. Thanks to the government of Colombia's concerted response, which included distribution of vaccines donated by the United States and others purchased by Colombia through COVAX, as well as USAID support for vaccine distribution, Antioquia was able to significantly reduce infection prevalence and death rates, decreasing from 4,000 in June to 301 recorded infections a day in mid-October. Region-wide, infection rates and death rates due to COVID-19 have decreased by 84% over the past 5 months. The region's economy, has been noted, is also improving, with the International Monetary Fund projecting an economic rebound of 6.3% in 2021, second only to emerging and developing economies in Asia. This is the kind of progress that USAID seeks to support throughout the region. As we've addressed the critical health situation, we've been keenly aware of the secondary impacts of the pandemic, including job losses and kids out of the classroom, growing food insecurity, increases in gender-based violence, and contraction of civil liberties and rights. USAID continues to address long-term challenges in the region through programs that foster inclusive economic growth, address climate change, improve citizen security, promote respect for human rights, fight corruption and promote transparency, elevate the voices of civil society and other community leaders, and enable diversity and participation by historically marginalized groups. Our efforts have not gone unnoticed. Partner nations regularly recognize and thank the United States for our steadfast support in the face of this unprecedented emergency. The solidarity reminds us all that this pandemic affects the entire world. We must continue to be good neighbors, partners, and friends so that we can overcome this challenge together. We're safe when everyone is safe. Even as we maintain our vigilance and continue to respond to the virus, we remain committed to helping countries adapt to new realities presented by the pandemic and shore up hard-won development gains. Ultimately, we seek to help the people of the region live in peace and prosperity and realize a more healthy, hopeful future. Mr. Chairman, Senator Rubio, thanks again for the opportunity to testify. I welcome your questions.
We'll have a 5-minute round of questions for the witnesses, and I would just like to begin by asking you both this question. The U.S. total delivery of vaccines to the region is about 49 million, and that is significantly behind Chinese vaccine delivery to the region. The three of us did join together in a letter to the administration many months ago saying there are a lot of reasons to prioritize the Americas. One, because of family and other ties between the United States and folks in the Americas, a disease that knows no borders. If we prioritize the region, it will keep us healthier. Second, the follow-on consequences of this health pandemic in the region produce economic and other instabilities that can be a push factor for migration. We're dealing with tough migration issues. It would help us deal with those issues if we were more forward-leaning in helping nations in the region access vaccines. And third, we pointed out and have been very aware of the efforts of China and Russia to use vaccines in the region, and why would we want to be on our back foot while they're racing ahead? What explains why, even though we are the single biggest donor of vaccines in the world, what explains why our vaccine donations to the Americas, which has suffered so disproportionately, still are lagging behind China?
Mr. Chairman, one of the factors is as you mentioned in your own opening remarks, it was the priority that we had to give to domestic requirements. Secondly, that we went through rigorous procedures to make sure that anything that we donated was safe and reliable and encompassed some of the sorts of the broader support elements that Mr. Natiello was just referring to. When you add these along with, there are also commercial deals that companies have, and some of those are also American providers. We've tried to focus our donations on the areas most in need, and we're taking a look at the hard numbers, at the facts, the case rates, the death rates, the current vaccination rates in particular countries, and to respond to surges in the most agile way that we can, to make sure that the vaccines that we donate are safe, reliable, and are turned from vaccines into vaccinations, because vaccine isn't any good to anyone until it gets into somebody's shoulder and gets into someone's arm.
Let me push a little bit farther on that. I actually understand why we might have been slow out of the blocks to do deliveries in June when other nations were faster, because we were putting a priority first on making sure folks in the United States were vaccinated, and we also have quality standards about vaccines that are superior to what China and Russia have, and that encompasses some delay that I understand. But if I just look at the amount of vaccines delivered by the United States into the region, you would think one of the factors might be, well, if this is a region that's experiencing 30% of the deaths in the world, then why wouldn't 30% of American vaccines be going into the region? I haven't done the math on it, but it seems to me that vastly less than 30% of American vaccines going abroad have gone into the region. And so I sort of wonder about and Senator Rubio mentioned this in his opening comments, what are the allocation factors that the administration is using And might we expect to see, particularly in the run-up to the summit for the Americas, might we expect to see even a more aggressive approach from the United States in terms of delivering vaccines to the region?
I can say that as we prepare for the summit, as we look through 2022, the President has made a commitment to try to beat back this pandemic worldwide by the time the world next convenes at the UN General Assembly, and that we want to push through to the summit as well.
My time is about up. I'm going to yield to Senator Rubio.
Well, I just want to continue to touch upon when we determine who gets what, when we make this big purchase of vaccines and we start sending them, what's the criteria we use to determine this country's going to get it, this country's not, this country's going to get X amount, this country's going to get that amount? Is there a criteria that's being used to determine how this is being distributed globally, and in particular, how that impacts this region?
I think that the goal is looking at capacity, how we can maximize the number of vaccine doses available in a country and do so equitably for the greatest number of countries and the greatest number of people at risk within those societies. We take a look at the data in terms of surges and how to mitigate potential surges, how to cut off surges when they've already appeared, and giving priority to protecting people in the healthcare sectors who need to care for those who are ill. So we try to base it on the best and most reliable public health data that we have available, and we do try to give priority as well to areas at risk.
If I could just add to that, Senator, we look at a variety of factors, including case rates, death rates, and hospitalizations, current vaccination rates in a country, again, responding to surges, and a country's ability to receive vaccines and put shots into arms, as well as U.S. national and economic security.
And so when you say, obviously, the case numbers are what they are, everyone's had a surge, some bigger than others, depends on how much they're testing, how much they're monitoring. Hospitalization rates are often dependent on whether there are hospitals or hospital availability. What I'm hearing, though, potentially, is that part of it is if a country doesn't have, for example, a healthcare system that can actually organize people and get people vaccinated, if a country doesn't have the ability to store vaccines and get them to people fast enough before they expire, that I would imagine is a big factor in how we're determining this. Donating 10 million vaccines to a country that doesn't have healthcare infrastructure to distribute them, and therefore they're going to go bad, they're going to expire, they're not going to get to people. Is that a major factor in how this is being decided?
So those are important criteria, and that's precisely why USAID is focused on strengthening health systems in our partner nations, because we want them to be able to not only receive the vaccine, but clearly to get shots in arms, which is why we do things like support the cold chain, support training of vaccinators, support communications campaigns to overcome vaccine hesitancy. And in some countries, the level of readiness far exceeds that in other countries. So the challenge, for instance, in a country like Haiti is very, very different than a country like Brazil or Honduras, so these are the kind of things that we look at. These are the kind of things that we apply U.S. technical assistance to help get those vaccines in arms.
Now, the other thing I wanted to ask is, both the Kremlin and the Communist Party in China are engaged globally in a large-scale disinformation campaign trying to discredit the American origin vaccines, particularly Moderna and Pfizer, and promote their own. And so what are we doing in the region in particular? I think there's a broader communication issue. We've seen the RT Spanish version has grown in audience, unfortunately, and it's a big challenge in the region that we have to confront as well. But what are we doing to counter that in particular, this sort of disinformation campaign about vaccines, specifically in Latin America?
First off, sir, bringing light to exactly what you spoke about. You can't play whack-a-mole on every bit of disinformation. What you have to do is make sure that you bring true facts, accurate information. You have to do it repetitively, and you have to make sure that you work to get those messages out to communities. I think Peter could probably speak a little bit more on the details of how we do that. But the fundamental principle is you have to beat bad information, which is rife, and disinformation, which is rife and has been motivated from Russia in particular, but also from China. And you have to flood the zone with better, more reliable information and make sure that people who are trusted in the communities all over this hemisphere, where their governments are having uptake problems, bring that information to their publics so that they overcome this challenge.
Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, to you and the ranking member. I appreciate you holding this hearing on a very important topic. Deputy Assistant Secretary O'Reilly, the pandemic exposed many of the region's weaknesses, including widening social inequalities, widespread informality, growing environmental risks, a gender-based violence epidemic, and weak healthcare and education institutions. When you pair that with massive population displacement and efforts by certain leaders to systematically dismantle democratic institutions, I'm concerned that the next decade in the hemisphere will be a turbulent one, unless the United States, the international communities, and our partners in the region are strategic in addressing these increasingly complex challenges. Now, from my own perspective, the administration's vaccine diplomacy and policy in the Western Hemisphere has been a failure. Let me give you an example. I was talking to a president in the hemisphere, and he said to me, I am pro-American. But in the midst of the pandemic, I wanted to buy. I wasn't even looking for donations of vaccines. I wanted to buy vaccines for my people. I couldn't get anywhere with the U.S. government. China sold them the vaccines. Maybe less efficient, but if you've got nothing, then you'll take something at the end of the day. I am privatizing for the first time our energy infrastructure. Try to get America interested in the possibilities. China comes along and says, we'll buy the bonds. We're having challenges with the IMF, which is a problem that is beyond this country that I'm referring to. It's hemispheric. Because look at what we did as a government to ultimately deal with the economic challenges of the pandemic, how much money we pumped into the economy and to help families. But not every country has that wherewithal. And yet the IMF is creating a series of conditions that they insist without creating a smoothing period so that these countries can get through this difficult time and the economic consequences of the COVID pandemic. So the Chinese come to this president and say, okay, we lend to you at 1%. Now, we missed the boat on vaccines in the Western Hemisphere. And all of us wrote to you meaning the administration, urging you to do take a much different course. You can have all the calculuses you want. I can create the little boxes and checks to say that we systematically did it this way. But the reality is, in our own hemisphere, in our own front yard, with all of the nexus of family and trade and migration, in our own interests, forget about being a good neighbor, in our own interests, it made eminent sense to significantly deploy the vaccine in the hemisphere. We failed. China was in there, they got the goodwill, and we failed. So now the question is, how do we deal with the aftermath of that failure in the context of the economic challenges that are facing these countries? So can you tell us how you're working with the Treasury Department to ensure that the United States uses its voice and its vote at the IMF and the World Bank to ensure greater flexibility and increase access to resources for these developing countries as they pursue their post-COVID-19 recovery?
Well, thank you, Senator, for the question. I mean, one of the things that the administration's doing is working with other members of the International Monetary Fund to develop the Resilience and Sustainability Trust over at the IMF, and seeking also additional or authorization to lend $21 billion to poor and low-income countries, and putting a focus particularly on areas which have been really walloped by this first year and a half to 2 years of the pandemic, small islands economies. And there's a particular focus in doing so on the Caribbean. And I think that's going to be one significant process underway. We also work very closely with the Inter-American Development Bank. I also have responsibilities for preparing for the Summit of the Americas next year. And we have a process underway of reviewing, I know, keen interest that you and other members of this committee have in the future of our...
Mr. Chairman, if I may, so I appreciate all of that, but here's the point. Mm-hmm. If we do not use our voice and our vote at the IMF and the World Bank, you will see more of what you saw in Colombia. Colombia is being squeezed by the IMF. The Duque administration responded by doing a series of fiscal issues that the IMF wanted to see, and there was social unrest. If you do not, I'm not talking about people walking away from their obligations. I'm talking about creating a smoothing period so that they can get through what we are getting through as a country, but they do not have the wherewithal to get through as a country, so that, in fact, they can then meet their obligations. If we don't do that, we're going to see enormous social unrest. And we might as well turn the hemisphere over to authoritarian figures, because they will say the way to solve your problems is not through this democratic process, but through authoritarianism, which is unfortunately rampant. And I'm glad you raised the IDB as the last point I'll make. All of us here have been advocating for a capital increase for the Inter-American Development Bank as part of the U.S. effort to support the region's economic recovery. And I thought this administration would embrace our bipartisan effort to do exactly that, because if you want to deal with China in terms of its pervasive presence in the hemisphere, you create the wherewithal to meet the challenge of what they are doing in the hemisphere by an institution like the IDB and by the DFC and others. At the end of the day, why is it that the administration has not embraced a 10th capital increase?
My understanding, Senator, is that the issue remains under review, and we certainly have had discussions about this with our colleagues of the Treasury Department, and we do recognize the absolutely essential role that the Inter-American Development Bank plays in this hemisphere, and that it needs to be able to act in the most robust way possible within its authority.
Well, while we are navel-gazing about this issue, it seems to me it's rather straightforward. China is displacing our influence in the region, and we have no tools to effectively deal with that. So maybe we can stop looking at our navel, figure out how we are going to support an increase and under what conditions, and then get the IDB with the U.S. representative there to start engaging in the hemisphere in a way that can turn the dynamics around. Because I'm telling you, as someone who has spent 30 years in not only in foreign affairs, but most specifically focused on the hemisphere, we are losing and losing fast. This is not just this administration, but nonetheless, it is this administration that has the power to change it, and it should. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
Second round of questions. I have two topics that I would like to raise. Help the committee understand the decision makers on allocation of American vaccines. So there's criteria and there's factors, but we are the most generous in the world totally, but who is making the decisions about allocations to countries and regions? Ultimately, the decisions are the president's, but is this a State Department function? Is it a multi-agency roundtable? Help us understand this.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So the process to determine vaccine provision internationally is led by the National Security Council and the White House COVID-19 teams. It does include inputs from USAID, from the State Department, HHS, and the CDC. That's my understanding of that process.
Do you know who's the leader at the NSC of this allocation decision-making process?
Well, it's the NSC COVID team, but I can't tell you exactly who the person is. I don't know if my colleague Das Riley has
Mr. O'Reilly, do you know who at the NSC has this billet?
I will confess that it is somewhere on the tip of the tongue. I cannot pull it up at this moment.
I'll ask it for the record, but if you think of it in the next couple of minutes, please let us know. Because again, I mean, there are many factors that you would use, but if you just look at the critical nature of the Americas, the connection between the Americas and the United States and the death toll in the Americas as a percentage of the global death toll, it just still seems like the allocation of vaccines is pretty out of whack with what the threat in the region and the threat to the United States is. Second question. One of the things that we can do to really help any region is inspire local production of vaccines. So the Pan American Health Organization in September announced that it had selected 2 biomedical centers in Argentina and Brazil to develop and produce COVID vaccines, and China's Sinovac Biotech also announced in August that they would open a manufacturing facility in Chile in the first half of 2022. What is the U.S. doing, if anything, to support local development of vaccines in the Americas?
Well, I've certainly seen and I've heard directly from colleagues, counterparts in governments from Argentina to Colombia. I know also expressions of interest in Mexico and elsewhere that they have taken a look at the circumstances in which our hemisphere has found itself. And these long and unreliable, sometimes politically unreliable, supply chains have concerned them deeply. And so we've certainly entered into discussion. Just recently we sent down, actually the administration sent down, a team led by our colleagues from HHS and CDC to dive deep into the topic in Colombia, for example, and take a look at the kinds of regulatory frameworks, the types of protections of intellectual property, the types of technical training, the standards that they would need. And we've had similar discussions with, perhaps not at the same depth, but we've had similar discussions over the course of this pandemic elsewhere in South America, I know, and to try to figure out or help people figure out how they need to adapt their policies and their investment environments to attract those kinds of investments. And it's a priority also because it's a good way to create good, reliable jobs and strengthen connections and ties with the U.S. and the United States industry.
Senator Rubio.
Mr. O'Reilly, we have you here today. I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about the Summit of Democracies that's coming up in December. The government of interim President Juan Guaido, we recognize that the official U.S. policy remains that is the legitimate government in Venezuela. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct.
Why isn't Venezuela on the list and his government on the list of countries that are being invited to the Summit of Democracies? Or has that changed?
The White House makes the final calls as to how to organize this White House scheduled and structured event. I don't I'm not aware that the final list of participants and speakers has been completed. We certainly have not invited every government in the hemisphere or in the globe to this event. It will be a representative group of government and non-governmental officials and representatives, and it is the first phase of a two-phase summit process, which will end in an in-person event next year. And its principles are a fundamental through line as well for our Summit of the Americas preparations.
Oh, no, I understand all that. My point is, if the U.S. policy is that the interim government of President Guaido is a legitimate government, and we are trying to strengthen both the leverage and credibility of the pro-democracy movement in Venezuela, not inviting them, even in an initial list, to a summit of democracies is certainly not helpful to that, and I would argue is quite damaging. And so I guess my point is, I get that the White House makes the final decision, but I'm curious, what is the State Department's position on it, or what, if you could share with us, is the State Department against them being included in the list? Are you involved in the formation of the list? I would imagine that they're talking to you as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere about who should be on that list.
Yeah, we've been in consultations with the organizers within the administration of the event pretty much from the get-go, Senator. And first, to the fundamental question. Look, we recognize the National Assembly, and the National Assembly decided to elect Juan Guaido as its president. Given that Nicolás Maduro stole the presidential election, manipulated the prior election, we could call it last year, for the National Assembly, and has skewed the table so rawly that Sunday's event will in no way represent anything that's free and fair. We understand where democratic principles rest in terms of our relationship with Venezuela, and we understand who's blunting the democratic aspirations of the Venezuelan people.
So then why aren't they on the list? If that's all great, why isn't that reflected, I would imagine, in the first iteration of the list that's been put out there? You would think that it would be at the top of the list, not an afterthought, or we'll wait and see what we're going to do. My question, I mean, do you favor them being on the list? Is there anybody in the State Department that's against them being on the list? That's what I'm trying to get at. Why aren't they on there? Is it? I mean, I can't imagine, given everything you've just said, that we've forgotten about how important this would be for them to be included.
Senator, I must say, in terms of the regional focus of my portfolio, it's my highest priority to work to support the democratic aspirations of the Venezuelan people. It's, I think, exceptionally important that Mr. Maduro accept the reality of what he's done to his country and to come back to the table to negotiate a fairer, a more democratic, a more open society.
No, I understand, but that doesn't explain why Guaido is not on, or whoever they choose as their, whether it's him or somebody else to be the Speaker of the National Assembly, why they aren't on the list, given everything you've just said.
I understand the concern, and I'll bring it back with me, Senator.
I think my time is up.
I want to thank both witnesses on this first panel for your questions. We may have questions for the record to submit as well. I'll make an announcement about that at the end of the hearing. Should there be questions for the record, we would encourage you to be prompt in responses. But thank you so much for your service and for appearing today. And with that, let's get the witnesses from the second panel to come out, and we'll proceed with them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oops, that's not going to work.
Oh, that's, ooh, yeah, 100%. Excuse me. Hey, so O'Reilly, how does the mic work? I was just giving you a hard time. Right, they're just messing with you.
Well, we want to welcome the witnesses on panel 2, very important hearing. Let me now introduce you. I'm going to begin with Mr. Rundy. Daniel Rundy is the Senior Vice President of the Project on Prosperity and Development in Americas program and holds the William Schreier Chair in Global Analysis at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Previously, he held senior leadership roles at the International Finance Corporation, and from 2005 to 2007, he was the director of the Office of Global Development Alliances at USAID, lifetime member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and a graduate of both Dartmouth College and Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. Mr. Rundy, welcome. Glad to have you with us today. Dan Restrepo, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress for nearly 6 years, and through 2 presidential campaigns served as the principal advisor to President Obama on issues related to Latin America, the Caribbean, and Canada, and then served as special assistant to the president and senior director for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the National Security Council. Previously, he created and directed the Americas Project, which focused on Latin America and the role of Hispanics in the United States at the Center for American Progress, served as a judicial clerk on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, and worked for former Representative Lee Hamilton on the staff of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He's a graduate of University of Virginia, University of Pennsylvania School of Law. And finally, Dr. Arachu Castro, who is the Samuel Z. Stone Chair of Public Health in Latin America and Director of the Collaborative Group for Health Equity in Latin America at Tulane School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. Prior to joining Tulane in 2013, she was the Associate Professor of Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School. She's a member of the World Health Organization's Strategic and Technical Advisory Group of Experts for Maternal, Newborn, Child, Adolescent Health and Nutrition, and has also worked as a consultant for numerous intergovernmental public health organizations, including Pan American Health Organization, the WHO, and UNICEF. Dr. Castro is a PhD from the School for Advanced Studies in Social Sciences in Paris, a PhD in Social Sciences from the University of Barcelona, and a Master of Public Health from the Harvard School of Public Health. I want to thank all the witnesses, beginning in the order that I introduced you. If you would each testify, confine your comments to about 5 minutes. Your full comments will be included in the record, and then we'll look forward to engaging in dialogue with you. Mr. Rundy.
Thank you, Senator Kaine. Thank you, Senator Rubio. It's a privilege to be here before this committee. In addition to being a moral and the right thing to do from a public health standpoint, whichever country is seen as solving the COVID-19 vaccine challenge is going to reap enormous public diplomacy benefits. The United States must play a more prominent, more decisive role in leading distribution of safe and effective vaccines, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. Vaccine delays in the Americas will mean economic stagnation in the region, likely resulting in more migration to our southern border. The Chinese and Russian governments took advantage of a 9-month window when the United States and the West could not provide vaccines to the developing world because of a mix of vaccine nationalism, lack of coordination, and disagreement over how to distribute the vaccines. China has used its global vaccine campaign to advance long-term foreign policy objectives. The following examples are anecdotal but highly believable, and the committee should remain vigilant. China has allegedly tied its vaccine manufacturing capacity and distribution to pushing Huawei-driven ICT solutions in countries like Brazil and the Dominican Republic, two allies of the United States. On the issue of Taiwan, China is accused of pressuring Paraguay to recognize the mainland in return for vaccines. Similarly, China assured El Salvador of a higher level of vaccines, highly likely related to its non-recognition of Taiwan. The other two countries that comprise the Northern Triangle, Guatemala and Honduras, recognize Taiwan and have not received the same levels of vaccines from China. And as a result, there are credible reports in Honduras and Guatemala that if we had only recognized the mainland, we'd get more vaccines. And there also seems to be, for some reason, a series of vaccine campaigns on border towns bordering El Salvador and Guatemala with El Salvador. They seem to be awash in Chinese vaccines. The good news is that the U.S. has made substantial but incomplete progress in reversing the narrative by aggressively ramping up its distribution of COVID-19 vaccines globally. We have an opportunity because the Chinese and Russian-funded vaccines are just not as good as Western vaccines. So we have a chance to close the gap. We need to do several things. The first is we need to strengthen a coherent interagency response to addressing the COVID-19 pandemic in the region. This response should include a comprehensive vaccination plan with clear strategies regarding vaccine supply logistics, communication, monitoring, evaluation, impact. Second, the U.S. should move to a 50-50 strategy where 50% of vaccines are delivered bilaterally and the other 50% of vaccines are delivered multilaterally. Currently, the Biden-Harris administration has said we're going to deliver 75% multilaterally and 25% bilaterally. I would suggest 50-50, not 75-25. Also, the Biden-Harris administration should prioritize countries in Latin America and the Caribbean that have not yet reached 70% national vaccination rates. We still have a long way to go in a number of countries. Third, the U.S. should directly assist governments in the region that still require it for preparing for national level vaccination campaigns. Fourth, we need to develop for the future capable regional manufacturing platforms so that other countries can help us answer the mail on vaccine production in the future. Any Democratic government is going to prioritize Pennsylvania over Paraguay, no offense to Paraguay, just because of the political realities. And so we're going to just need to have more production capacity to respond to this. The iron laws of vaccine nationalism are going to be really hard to break. So ultimately, we need to find partners. It could be Uruguay, it could be Costa Rica, countries that have strong rule of law, a respect for democracy, a capable workforce. We need to have we need additional surge capacity to make vaccines because that's ultimately the long-term answer to this. We need, fifth, public-private partnerships to assist on things like pandemic early warning systems. We have a number of ways of dealing with early warning, but frankly, we could do more. There are new technologies, and we should be leveraging the private sector. Finally, we should be thinking about how we're working with partners. That could include Taiwan, that can include Canada, that can include Brazil, and we should absolutely be leveraging the multilateral institutions that are part of how we respond. Finally, the U.S. has an opportunity to finish strong on solving the COVID-19 pandemic. If countries do not receive vaccines from America or our allies, they will seek vaccines from our strategic competitors. Great power competition has come to global health. We should commit to achieving widespread immunity in the region and prepare for future pandemics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Estrepo.
There we go. Chairman Kaine, Senator Rubio, thank you very much for this opportunity. As has been well established so far in this hearing, it's difficult to overstate the importance of U.S. vaccine diplomacy in Latin America and the Caribbean. In fact, one can argue that through its vaccine diplomacy, the Biden administration is engaged in the most important U.S. strategic initiative in the Americas in decades. To understand why it is critical to step back and examine the cascading crises that faced Latin America and the Caribbean before COVID-19, how the pandemic exacerbated them, and what it all means for U.S. interests. In early 2020, the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean were amidst a historic dislocation of vulnerable populations, home to some of the highest levels of citizen insecurity in the world, awash in mis and disinformation, both homegrown and state actor generated, undermining the region's basic social fabric, buffeted by the intensifying effects of the climate crisis, plagued by multiple governance failures and worse, characterized by corruption, populism, and authoritarianism. And perhaps most fundamentally concerning, the region was suffering a profound crisis in confidence in democracy's ability to deliver at scale for the people of the Americas. In 2018, fewer than half of all Latin Americans viewed democracy as the preferred form of government, and only 24% reported being satisfied with their democracy. And then COVID-19 hit. To date, the pandemic has claimed at least 1.5 million lives across the region, representing more than 30% of all worldwide reported deaths in a region with 8% of the world's population. Triggered the most severe regional economic contraction in the world and the slowest economic recovery. It plunged 22 million people into poverty and 8 million into extreme poverty, and that was only in the last 9 months of 2020. It exacerbated the irregular movement of people throughout the hemisphere. So the nearly 50 million doses of U.S. manufactured COVID-19 vaccines distributed to date by the United States is sound policy on numerous levels. It's a vital component of any effective strategy to mitigate the unprecedented movement of people that I just mentioned. It's an investment in the U.S. economy, and particularly our export sector, given that fully a third of U.S. exports are to countries in the Western Hemisphere. It's also pretty sound basic public health policy, given that most foreign visitors to the United States, particularly relevant as we open up international travel, are from our closest neighbors. But above all else, it's better application of U.S. power for geopolitical benefit. It's the best possible demonstration project that democracy can deliver for the people of the Americas. It draws a stark contrast with China's attempts, which we have been discussing this morning, to use vaccine diplomacy for its own ends, particularly because the superior efficacy of U.S. manufactured vaccines has made the U.S. the increasingly sought-after partner of choice, including by countries that were high-profile recipients of initial Chinese, and to a lesser extent, Russian largesse. And because they're delivered without strings, U.S. manufactured vaccines also underscore a steady confidence in the power of innovation and collaboration, two characteristics that made those vaccines possible, but also which draw a critical distinction between what is great about the United States and what fuels China's rise. In short, helping end the COVID-19 pandemic, making economic recovery more possible, and instilling greater faith in the promise of democracy across the Americas amounts to an essential historic demonstration of U.S. leadership in the face of a region and regional tumult likely to continue for years to come. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Castro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Tim Kaine and Ranking Member Marco Rubio.
Is your microphone on? If so, you may need to pull it a little bit closer to you. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Tim Kaine and Ranking Member Marco Rubio for inviting me to testify today. My comments complement the written statement that I submitted yesterday. The pandemic continues to create great human suffering in Latin America and the Caribbean, where an estimated 2.2 million people have died of COVID-19. This includes both reported and an estimate of underreported deaths. Although more men than women have died of COVID, not included in these mortality statistics are the thousands who have died due to the disruption of essential health services, such as women of reproductive age, children, and adolescents. Additionally, last year, the pandemic caused the worst economic contraction in more than a century, deepening social and economic inequalities and increasing poverty. The underfunding of scientific and technological research and development in most countries in the region is at the root of the limited capacity to develop novel vaccines and the uneven rollout of vaccines. Despite a regional vaccine procurement mechanism since 1979, the Pan American Health Organization's revolving fund for vaccine procurement, most countries negotiated access to COVID-19 vaccines last year through bilateral agreements with vaccine developers from the United States, Europe, Russia, and China. At the same time, most also participated in the COVAX mechanism, whose procurement agent in the Americas is the revolving fund. Although half of the population is fully vaccinated, significant differences exist between countries. The inequity behind the distribution of vaccines is primarily explained by the type of participation in the COVAX mechanism, which has been severely affected by the concentration of doses in high-income countries and the interruption of vaccine exports from the largest manufacturer of vaccines in the world, located in India. As of last Friday, among the 10 countries that participate in COVAX as donor-dependent, only 26% of the population is fully vaccinated. Coverage ranges from less than 1% in Haiti to 61% in El Salvador. On the other hand, among the self-financing participants in COVAX, twice as many, 51%, of the population is fully vaccinated. Coverage ranges from 16% in Jamaica to 81% in Chile. Cuba, which did not participate in COVAX and is the only country in the region that has developed its own COVID vaccines, has fully vaccinated 70% of its population. The divide reflected by this data can undermine all efforts to bring the pandemic to an end in the Americas, where it continues to have a devastating impact due to the uneven deployment of vaccines, the lack of a regional systematic vaccination strategy, the limited capacity to develop novel vaccines, and the reliance on imported vaccines. Consequently, 2 months ago, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States approved a plan for self-sufficiency in health matters in Latin America and the Caribbean, prepared by the Economic Commission of Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC. The United States has the opportunity to help support this regional plan by, number one, facilitating technology transfer and the development of manufacturing capacity for mRNA vaccines. 2, training and qualifying specialized human resources. 3, equipping national and regional laboratories. And 4, leveraging regional supply chains to help increase production capacity in a region of 660 million and insufficient vaccine development. Latin America and the Caribbean has, however, research capacity, scientific development, and technological innovation centers that are underfunded and that should be strengthened to discover and manufacture vaccines. Thank you for your attention.
We'll move to questions now, and just to let you know that there's a voting schedule that's a little bit up in the air. There's no vote called now. That's great. If there is a vote, you could see us coming and going, but we'll jump right in. I think we're all on the same page in terms of realizing the importance of American vaccine diplomacy in the Americas. They're our neighbors. Travel and family connections and connections of commerce are intense. The pandemic has hurt neighboring countries in such a way that it creates migration pressures that we feel here. And our chief strategic adversary, China, is very engaged in trying to grab the mantle of leadership in the Americas from the United States. All those things are true. And yet I'm puzzled about the American deployment of vaccines to the region because it doesn't seem to match up with the things that I've just stated, which I think are kind of consensus positions. We have donated about 49 million vaccines to the region. I traveled to the region in July. They like the quality of the American vaccines. They like that there's no strings attached. They like that they're donated rather than sold. But if I look overall at what the United States is doing, and I believe we're the most generous donor of vaccines in the world, but the percentage of our vaccines that are going into the Americas, which is disproportionately suffering and disproportionately connected to us, seems very, very small. Those decisions are made by a process and ultimately made at the National Security Council. But let me put the proposition on the table, and I'd love to hear you respond to it, that we should be allocating a percentage of the American vaccines into the Americas that is more equivalent to the suffering level in the Americas. If it's 30% of deaths with 8% of the population, I don't think we should be giving 8% of vaccines to the Americas. I think we should be giving significantly more, both because of the extent of suffering and because of the direct connection between conditions in the Americas and conditions here. What do any of you think of that proposition I put on the table?
So, Senator, if I may, we've been very generous, but we could be doing more. I would propose that we might consider thinking about our health border going all the way to Panama and prioritizing at least North America plus Central America in a special way in the future in terms of future pandemics. I know that the world is crying out for vaccines, but in some ways, as I said earlier, if in a democracy, we're always going to prioritize Pennsylvania over Paraguay, but if we consider the entire Western Hemisphere our health border because microbes don't respect walls, then we would perhaps think differently about how we're allocating vaccines in that construct. There have been suggestions by serious public health professionals to do something like that. So I do think that's something for us to consider. It is good news that we produce far higher quality vaccines, and they are in demand. I've spoken to a number of embassies in preparation for this hearing, and a number of countries that have taken Sinovac. The Chinese vaccines are adding Pfizer as boosters because they know what China is offering is not very good. I could use other words, but I'll go with not very good, Senator. So I would just say that we have an opportunity to finish strong. It's been unfortunate that they took advantage of a tactical window, and they've pressed other geostrategic priorities, Huawei, Taiwan recognition. A friend of mine who's a prominent political consultant in the region is friends with the president of Paraguay, and he said, tell your friends in America, I'm not going to flip to the mainland, but tell them the Americans are offering me nothing. Now, this was at one point. And so I just think we've got, we need to think about, we can't fight something with nothing. And so I do think ultimately we're going to have other funny named diseases happen like clockwork for a whole series of reasons. And so I don't want to sit in my basement again for 18 months, and I don't think anyone else in the Western Hemisphere does. And so I think we need to prepare differently. And one of the things is we need to have surge capacity to manufacture, not just in the United States, but in places. It could be Uruguay, it could be Costa Rica, we could partner with Argentina, we could partner with Brazil. But in the meantime, we have a job to do. We need to finish the job strong.
Mr. Restrepo, yeah, finish strong. I got that from your testimony. I like that idea, Mr. Restrepo. And then I have a second question for you, Dr. Castro.
Senator, if I may, I think two things are important here. One is COVID-19 exposed pre-existing conditions of all shapes and sizes, one of which is a lack of strategic attention to the Americas. That has been longstanding by the United States in terms of our geostrategic balance in the world. And I think this is a result of kind of hardwired structural biases towards attention, time and attention in the national security space to other parts of the world ahead of the Americas. And I think your recommendation is a very solid one, that given the deep interconnection and the deep strategic interest the United States does have in the Americas, and given the level of devastation wrought by this pandemic in this region, our response should be proportionate to that and not proportionate to our pre-existing lack of attention. And again, over decades, this is not a pre-existing just with this administration or even the administration in which I served.
Dr. Castro, you mentioned something in your testimony that I think is really important. and that is U.S. participation in local manufacturing of vaccines and trying to play a leadership role there. The Caribbean and Latin American nations are exploring that. And I think there's a lot of good that we can do. Even better than donating would be the U.S. playing a significant role in the development of local capacity. And I'm certainly going to urge that on the administration. We asked the panel before what the U.S. is doing, and there was a nice answer, but it was basically, well, we're thinking about it. We're kind of talking to them and seeing what we might be able to do. We need to be doing better than that because Sinovac is committed to doing a vaccine production in Chile. There's other local vaccine production initiatives. The U.S. should be using our innovation and our technical expertise to try to help those initiatives. And I really appreciate you putting that on the table. I've gone over my time, and I want to yield now to Senator Rubio.
Thank you. I could probably ask this of the entire panel. I'll start with you, Mr. Rundy. One of the things I'm fascinated by in general is supply chains, right? And the fact that our supply chains in this country are deeply dependent on locations in the Asia-Pacific region for a lot of different reasons. And it strikes me that if we had some of these supply chains, obviously in the United States preferably, but if not in the U.S., in the Western Hemisphere, it would have a dual purpose. First, it would create some diversity, and therefore we wouldn't see some of the container backlogs. There'd be other ports that'd be available to take some of this. And second, it would solve a lot of the sort of socioeconomic issues in some of these countries. In essence, I know the answer, okay, but I'm not sure. But I imagine a world in which Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Haiti, were countries that had vibrant manufacturing sectors, downscale in the production, but that created stable employment for young people so they wouldn't have to leave their countries. I get rule of law and other things of that nature become a problem in many of these places. In particular, as I look at Pfizer designating factories in China as the main manufacturer of vaccines for the greater region, that includes Taiwan, you can only imagine how that would be used. And third, because I think we're entering an era that I think is going to be, best way to say it is biomedical nationalism. There are plenty of countries around the world that have gone through this and said, never again will we not have the inability to make oxygen, the inability to make PPE, the inability to make medicine, the inability to manufacture a vaccine, and our basic goods, because pandemics disrupt supply chains, but so potentially can geopolitical conflict. So in specific and then in general, in specific, why haven't we seen, and what can we do to make it more so that places like Pfizer, Moderna, and other pharmaceutical companies return or enter the Western Hemisphere as a place to manufacture? Obviously, it's a U.S. territory, but Puerto Rico is a logical place, and it's one that I deeply believe that we should reinstate and do everything we can in tax policy. But what more can we do to encourage that specifically when it comes to the pandemic, and then more broadly in general in the region on other topics? And I know this. I know these countries have to do a lot, but what can we do to make the region more attractive in both the short and long term for this? And I'll start with you, Mr. Rundy, but I open it up to the whole panel.
Thank you, Senator. This is one of the key questions of the COVID pandemic. I've done 1,500 Zoom calls since March the 12th, 2020, and so have you, Senator. And one of my deep thoughts is that we're going to get a partial economic divorce from China. Maybe they can visit with their spouse and they can bring their new spouse to Thanksgiving, and maybe we can sit together at graduation for the kids. But we're going to have a very different kind of relationship with mainland China going forward. And so I think that's, I won't call it a silver lining, but perhaps it's a...
By the way, that's not just us.
Yeah. Everybody. I think everyone's going to get a partial economic divorce from China.
China plus one.
Yeah. China.
Look
right.
for
They can
some
bring to the blended family holiday picture. You get the idea, Senator. I think the point is I think that there are a number of steps. We're going to move from a just-in-time supply chain world to a just-in-case supply chain world. I don't think anybody in this room ever wants to depend on mainland China ever again for PPEs, pills, ventilators. When they started making threats about we're going to cut you off, those were fighting words. And so I think that was a wake-up call. So I think there's several things we could do specifically, and you, the senators, could do. Ecuador wants a free trade agreement. We ought to do it. Uruguay wants a free trade agreement. We ought to do it. Brazil would like a free trade agreement. We ought to do it. We ought to also fulfill the promise of CAFTA-DR. We haven't fully seen that happen. I think we have an opportunity at the Summit of the Americas to put some concrete things on the table. So I think one of the opportunities will be to ask the Biden-Harris administration, what are you doing in the aspects of trade to enable some of these things? I also think we ought to be using our foreign aid to grease the skids of some of these shifts in global supply chains. Japan is doing this. They're providing $1 billion to have Japanese companies move their factories from mainland China to, say, Southeast Asia. In theory, Mexico and Central America and the Caribbean could be, and Colombia and Brazil could be net winners of sort of these global shifts in supply chains. So some of it are trade agreements, some of it's about foreign aid. I think we ought to continue to have a constructive dialogue with the government of Mexico. I think, in theory, Mexico ought to be a net winner of some of these shifts in global supply chains. And then finally, on Puerto Rico, I absolutely agree with you, Senator. We ought to revisit some of those tax agreements that I guess went away in the 1990s. We ought to look at that. I know Governor Fortunio is someone who's very knowledgeable about these issues and be someone who I would be consulting about the details of it. I think you've put your finger on something very important, Senator. Thank you.
Senator Rubio, helping Latin American and Caribbean countries strengthen their manufacturing capacity and helping transfer mRNA technology, which definitely the mRNA vaccines are the superior vaccines. And those are the U.S. government can do so much to facilitate that technology transfer from Pfizer and Moderna. And those strengthening also local laboratories could have a great impact for the current pandemic and also for preparedness for future pandemics, and definitely would answer a lot of your concerns regarding the lack of employment opportunities and all the factors that trigger migration to the United States. So definitely strengthening the local production, strengthening public health systems, and because what has happened throughout the region in most countries, not in all, is that essential health services have been disrupted because of the COVIDization, as they say in Latin America, la COVIDización, and of the health systems. So everything else, for example, people give birth every day, and a lot of women have been unable to give birth in a good quality setting because of the way that COVID has overtaken a lot of the health services. So definitely strengthening local capacity to be able to respond better now and in the future. It's the best thing that the United States government can do. Thank you.
I have one additional question that I'd like to just put on the table. And Senator Rubio, thank you. This is an important hearing, and I think you've given us a lot we want to follow up on. But here's my last question. Without repeating anything you've already said, for example, in your opening testimony, if the White House were to call you tomorrow and say, hey, the Summit for the Americas, the primary focus of it is going to be public health, and that is, in fact, the case. So what should the United States be putting on the table at that summit in terms of a commitment in the public health space to deal with this COVIDization and the next chapter? What would your advice to the White House in prepping for the Summit for the Americas be?
Well, certainly getting prepared, thank you, getting prepared for the next epidemic. Hopefully we don't have another pandemic, but there will be. Yeah. And we need to look into the future because the present has been so dire with the crisis that COVID has created throughout all of the Americas. And strengthening health systems and looking at the future and improve the ties between the United States and the region would be what I would certainly hope that is discussed at the summit. Great. Thank you.
Mr. Estrepo.
Senator, along those lines, we have an antiquated set of inter-American institutions, right? The inter-American institutions were built primarily in the 40s. They were revamped in the 60s, and they correspond to issues of the 40s and the 60s, much more than they do to the dawn or not even the dawn of the 21st century. Mm-hmm. And one of these areas is public health and pandemic response. There's an interesting model to build off in terms of pandemic response mechanisms in North America through the North American Leaders Summit several summits ago, that's being held again today here in Washington, to build off of that platform to be ready for the next one, and to deepen public health cooperation in the region. PAHO is an organization with its challenges, and it needs to be modernized and brought so it is a more effective mechanism within the inter-American system to deal with very much 21st century challenges. Unfortunately, none of us want to be relegated to our basements. I think all of us are going to be facing future pandemics, and we need the international infrastructure in place now. And the Summit of the Americas provides a very good opportunity to begin the work of building that architecture.
Thank you. Mr. Runde, finally.
Thank you. There's been more digital payments, digital commerce, and distance learning in the last 80 weeks than in the last 80 years. So one of the things is thinking about how, and it's not just been in Fairfax County, but it's been in all over the Western Hemisphere. So the digital pipes of the future should not be Huawei and ZTE. It ought to be somebody other than that. So one of the things we ought to have at the Summit of the Americas is digitize the hemisphere and make sure that it's the good stuff and it's not mainland Chinese digital. Second, I think we need to get real about a capital increase for the Inter-American Development Bank. I understand what the issues are, and there's some hesitancy in the administration and some folks in the Congress about this. But frankly, the main solution, the collective action vehicle for the Americas is the Inter-American Development Bank. I believe it's going to be very difficult for those who dislike the current president of the Inter-American Development Bank to dislodge him, so we should work with him. And so my view is we should announce at the Summit of the Americas a capital increase. And as part of it, we should say we're going to make Taiwan a member, we're going to add Australia and the Quad as members of the Inter-American Development Bank, and as part of the ask, we're going to say we want to use some of that money to help set up new manufacturing capacities for vaccines in places like Costa Rica and Uruguay and put that on steroids. And I would also use some of that money for things like early warning systems. So that would be another thing I'd be asking for. So digital, a capital increase for the IDB. I've said, finish the job on vaccines, early warning systems. On PAHO and the WHO. The WHO was born in the mid-1940s, and in some ways born in sin, because we had set up PAHO 50 years before and was it's a very well-regarded organization in the hemisphere, PAHO. It's got some understandable criticisms here in the Senate and the Congress about some of its relations with Cuba. But overall, it's a very good organization. However, we get to pick the head of PAHO, and we didn't want to stop picking the head of PAHO. So when we set up the WHO head is sort of like the Holy Roman Emperor. It's neither holy nor Roman nor an emperor, and so they don't get to pick the head of PAHO. So we said, well, we'll set up a whole bunch of PAHOs in Asia and Africa and the Middle East. And so it's the same model. The regional folks get to pick that the one employee of PAHO who's an employee of WHO is the head of PAHO. So it creates all sorts of weird distortions. And I think one of the problems with this pandemic, and perhaps in Ebola as well in Africa, was that the regional heads are very responsive and sometimes perhaps too responsive to regional folks. And so I think one of the problems with the WHO is they took too darn long to go to DEFCON 5 in terms of this pandemic. And so I disagreed with the administration's the decision to re-up the head of WHO. I thought we ought to find, and there are plenty of other excellent candidates in Africa. We could have gone to the African Union and said we could find somebody else. So anyway, so I think one of the things at the Summit of the Americas would be to look at this issue of the PAHO and the WHO relationship, because I think anyone who's looked at it seriously will say it's a screwy arrangement that ought to be looked at.
Well, I want to thank the witnesses for your work and for being here today in your testimony. I'm going to ask colleagues if they would like to submit questions for the record, to try to do that by, today is Thursday, so we will say by the close of business tomorrow, Friday, November 19. And I would ask that members submit those questions, and if there are questions that are directed